Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back to ENG503. We have been discussing a number of short stories in this module, and from what you remember, you will recall that we started off this module by introduction to Gulliver's Travels, which is a travelogue and a satire. And then we moved on to short stories, and in short stories we've done a couple of short story writers. And when I was giving you the history of short story writing, I mentioned to you the fact that although the short story had its beginning in England, there was not much work that was done in short story writing in England, and it moved from England to the continent, to France and Russia, and it also moved across the ocean into the United States, and it was there that a lot of the work was done. I also explained to you that there are two prevalent forms of short story writing. One is the event plot story, and the other is the Chekhovian story. So although there are other categories of short stories, but so great is the influence of the Russian short story writer Anton Chekhov that to this day writers follow his style, which of course came to be known as the Chekhovian short story. The story that we're going to do today is by Mark Twain, and we've had a couple of short stories by Mark Twain. We had some by Edgar Allan Poe, and you saw how each story is different in the subject that it introduces, and also in the style with which the writer tackles the subject. With Edgar Allan Poe, you saw that there was some mystery and there was a conscious attempt to create suspense. With Mark Twain, it is a very different kind of short story writing, in the sense that it's a humorous short story. Now, it's not the kind of short story that's going to make you laugh outright, but it is the kind of short story that's going to bring a smile on your face. So the story that we are doing today is the celebrated jumping from of Calaveras County. And those of you who have seen frogs, who have observed frogs, not on the dissection table, but in the wild or in a pond, will know that a frog appears to have only one objective in life, and that is to jump. So you'll see frogs jumping from point A to point B, and it is when they put their weight on their hind legs and push themselves forward that they can jump. So Calaveras County, Mark Twain has come up with this name. He comes up with a lot of fictitious small towns in the United States, and he writes about them. This one is the Calaveras County, and now we're going to see what Twain is writing about here. So let's go on to the text of the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County. Okay, now here is where you have a photo that I downloaded from the internet. You can get it also. And it shows a frog sitting or in recumbent position. And then there's one that is jumping. So it's about the jumping frog that we are going to be talking about today. And if you look at the first slide of the text, it gives you a background of when it was published and the source from which the database has taken it. So it was published by Harper and Brothers originally. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. Now you might find the language of Twain slightly old-fashioned, but then you also need to remember that Twain was writing in the 19th century. We are living in the 21st century. Language has undergone a lot of change. English has evolved in this last century and a half at a very rapid pace. So don't get upset if some of the words do not appear to make any sense to you. Just listen to what I'm saying, and when you match it with the slides, it will not be difficult for you to understand the language of Mark Twain. You know that Mark Twain is the name that he wrote under, and that his actual name was Samuel Clemens. But those were the times when people wanted to have another name to write under. There were a number of reasons for that. There were women who were writing who took on men's names, like you have George Eliot. There were other people who didn't want it to be known that they were writing and publishing for money. And then there were those who just wanted to have a name that they had been unable to have for themselves, because your parents name you, you don't name yourself. So you don't have any choice in your name. And there are people who don't like their names. There are people who want to have their names changed. So this was one way. So Mark Twain was actually Samuel Clemens. So to come back to the story, the narrator talks about one of his friends writing from the East and wanting to know about his friend. Now you have to remember that when an American writer uses the East, it is in a particular context. It does not mean someone coming from, let's say, South Asia, someone coming from China or from India or Sri Lanka or Pakistan. It means someone coming from the eastern states. Okay? Remember, the United States is divided into not just the northern states and the southern states, but also the eastern states and the western states. So it is actually the East Coast and the West Coast. So Mark Twain says that one of my friends wrote to me from one of the eastern states, and remember, he's not specifying which county or which state his friend is writing from. And his friend wants to know about a person whose name is Leonidas W. Smiley. And he wants to know what he's like. So what are the instructions that are given? How far does the writer fulfill those instructions? That's what we are going to be discussing in this lecture. And he says, I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, is a story, is an imaginary character, and that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it succeeded. So Twain says, I'm sure that nobody by the name of Leonidas W. Smiley exists. And that, my friend, knowing what Wheeler is like, asked me to throw in that name because he knows that the moment he hears the name Smiley, he's going to start off on a story that is long and boring. Now, what Twain is trying to do here is to save himself at the very outset. At the very beginning, he says that it's not going to be an interesting story. And he conveys this opinion by telling us that he heard a long and boring story. So what he's going to do is relate a long and boring story. If we find it interesting, fine. If we don't, well, the writer has told us in the very beginning that it's going to be a long and boring story. So let's see if it turns out to be as long as he says and as boring as he claims it to be. So back to Simon Wheeler and Leonidas W. Smiley. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the dilapidated tavern in the decayed mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. A lot of detail Twain gives about facial expressions. He also gives you a lot of detail about the scene. And when you have time, do read his Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which is about a group of young boys and the different activities that they get into, the different experiences that they have. They're really very interesting. They were written for young boys, but to me they are as interesting for older people as for young children. So to come back to the Jumping Frog, the narrator, the writer, is asked by his friend to look up Simon Wheeler, and he finds him in a place. Now see how he sketches the entire atmosphere. He says that it was a barroom stove near which I found him taking a nap. The tavern, the inn, was dilapidated, old, and probably falling to pieces, because the very town itself is a decayed mining town. If you have heard of these mining towns, they mushroom, they come up overnight. There's a lot of construction, temporary buildings are set up while that mineral is being taken out of the earth. When those mines are empty of minerals, then the people move on. There are some who stay back, but there is never as much business or as much money as is seen while the work is being carried on in the mines. So once that mine is over and done with, only those people stay back who don't want to move on. So this is a decayed mining camp, and that's where you have this tavern. A place where there's no business is not going to have new buildings, is not going to have what are called state-of-the-art buildings. They're just going to have buildings that are there and that are being used. Whether they were built for that purpose or not does not make any difference. So this is where he finds Simon Wheeler, and he likes what he sees of Simon Wheeler because he sees an expression of gentleness and simplicity, and he has an a facial expression that is calm, that is serene. And so this is how we have our first image of Simon Wheeler. The writer wakes him up, and I told him a friend had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley, and this Leonidas W. Smiley is supposed to be a priest. So he says, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel. So he is looking for a priest. Of course you know that the minister in the United States is actually a priest. It's not like the ministers that we have here. We have the Minister for Foreign Affairs, you have the Minister for Shipping and Ports, etc. In the United States, you have priests who are called ministers. So this person, Leonidas W. Smiley, is supposed to be a minister, a priest, and he is also supposed to be young. And the writer says that I also asked Mr. Wheeler that if he could tell me anything about this Reverend Smiley, I would be very grateful. So then what Simon Wheeler does is he finds out that here's a person who has mentioned the name Smiley, and for Simon Wheeler the word Smiley triggers off a story. So he backs him into a corner and he draws his chair up so that the writer cannot move from that place. And then he sits down and he says, all right, I'll tell you a story. And he tells this whole story without smiling, without any expression on his face changing. As he says, he never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm. He never changed his voice. It just flowed on and on and on. But through that interminable narrative, there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius. So Simon Wheeler tells this whole story in such a way that the listener does not have any choice but to believe what Simon Wheeler is saying. That this is the way in which he narrates the story. And from here onwards, what Twain is going to do is quote the sections that were uttered by Simon Wheeler and by himself and by the other characters. So it's all in the form of a conversation, and you'll find the large number of the text from this point onwards in inverted commas, because part of a conversation or a dialogue that's taking place. So he says, Reverend Leonidas W. Well, there was a fellow here by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of 49 or 50. So he's talking about a time that is 25 years in the past. And he says that there was a man named Jim Smiley. I don't know about Leonidas W. Smiley, but I know about Jim Smiley. And then he starts off on this story, and he says that I know that this was the time, it was either the winter of 49 or the spring of 50. That's the time. So you see, he has a good memory for this kind of thing. And he says that I remember very well that was the time that he was here. And the strange thing about this man was that he was a gambler, not by profession, but by instinct, by choice, because he gambled on anything and everything. And he'll give you examples of how he gambled. Now, there are people who say that gambling is wrong, and there are people who say that gambling is a profession. Let us see what Twain thinks of gambling. And this is not the kind of gambling where you put a lot of money, but this is for entertainment. It's a sort of it's a way of life for this Jim Smiley that he's talking about. So he would bet on anything. And if he did not find a person to place a bet with, he would change sides. That is, he would bet both ways. So what he was doing was he was gambling against himself. It wasn't another individual that he was gambling with. So anything that suited the other person would suit him, just so that he could place a bet. So he bet on everything and anything in life. And he says he almost always won the bet. It was very rare that he bet on something that he would lose. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned, but that fellow offered to bet on it. Now you see, Mark Twain's style of writing has also changed. The language that he uses is that of the common people. It's not the language of the educated or the sophisticated section of society. So he changes his language because he's talking with his readers, and he's talking about a person who was not highly educated, not like you. Okay, so if there was a horse race, you'd find him flush or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Well, if there were two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. So it's not like he's preparing to gamble. He just sees something happening and he would say, okay, I'm going to make you a bet that this is what is going to happen. If I win, you give me so much. If I lose, I'll give you so much. So he was betting on everything. And even the priest who was about to give a sermon, he would bet on Parson Walker even. If he saw a bug going from point A to point B, he would bet on how long it would take him to get there. And he would, as Twain says, he would follow that straddle bug to Mexico just to find out where the bug was going and how long it would take him to get there. Of course, you couldn't actually follow a bug all the way to Mexico, but that is what Twain says in order to create a little humor, a little interest and amusement. So that's a picture of two of the creatures that Twain has mentioned on whom he would place bets. So he'd bet at anything. He'd bet on a horse, a cat, chicken, dog, etc., etc. And a lot of people who have placed bets with him can tell us about him, because he didn't just bet with one person. He would bet with anyone and anywhere at any time. It made no difference to him what he bet on, when he bet, and where he placed the bets. And he gives you the example and says, Parson Walker. Now again, there's a priest here. When Parson Walker's wife fell ill, for some time they thought that she was going to die. And one morning, Parson Walker came in, and Smiley got up to ask him how she was. And the parson was very happy because his wife was feeling better. So he said, well, she is much better, and thanked the Lord for his infinite mercy. And you know what Smiley says? She says, you know, I'll bet you 2.5 that she will not recover. Can you imagine the kind of bet that he's placing? He is placing a bet on the life of the man's wife. And he doesn't have any thought of who he is betting with or betting against. This Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag. But that was only in fun, you know, because of course she was faster than that. So this mare, this female horse that he had, she won a lot of money for Smiley. And how she won it, he's going to tell us. She appeared to be slow and always had the asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something of that kind. So this horse had a lot of problems, health problems, and yet the writer says she won a lot of races for him. So they used to give her a 200 or 300 yard start because they knew that she was going to go very slow. So they'd say, okay, you start off first and the other horses will start later. And so she would start first, and then the other horses would take off and they would pass her quickly. But always at the fag end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate like and come cavorting and straddling up and scattering her legs around limber, sometimes in the air and sometimes out to one side amongst the fences, and kicking up more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead, as near as you could cipher it down. Now here what Twain is doing is, in order to create humor, he brings in the conditions of human beings. And these are conditions of asthma, consumption, coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose. Coughing and sneezing maybe you can have a horse doing, but blowing her nose is something that is specifically human. And yet he says that this horse, this mare of Jim Smiley's, would somehow or the other win the race for him. Although it didn't appear that she would, yet when the race ended, you would find that she had won the race for Jim Smiley. Okay, now what do you see here? You see a picture of a dog, and Twain says that this was a small bull pup, and if you looked at him, he was very unimpressive. You would say that, you know, this is not the kind of dog that has a good pedigree. It's not the kind of puppy that you want to show to other people. The way you see people showing off their dogs, you know, my dog is a Labrador, my dog is a German Shepherd. In the same way, you have bulldogs. So he says it's not the kind of animal that you could show to other people. But as soon as there was money placed on him, as soon as there was a bet placed on him, that dog was transformed. And how he was transformed was that his underjaw would start to stick out. He became more impressive. It's like he sat up and said, all right, what do you think you are doing? So his entire appearance would change, his teeth would uncover and shine like the furnaces. And you know, a bulldog has to have a ferocious appearance. A dog might tackle him and bullyrag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times, but Andrew Jackson, and this is the name that he has given to his dog. Andrew Jackson was one of the presidents of the United States, and obviously it is because Jim Smiley liked the president Andrew Jackson that he had named his dog after him. So he appeared to be very unimpressive, but the moment there was a bet placed on him, his entire appearance was transformed. He took on a whole new personality. And if people still did not believe that he was capable of outfighting the other dog, they would increase the money of the bet, as he says, doubled and doubled until all the money was placed on a bet. And then all of a sudden, he would grab that other dog by the joint of his hind leg and freeze onto it. He wouldn't bite. He would just hold on to that hind leg, and he would not let go until they had to be separated by force. And when that happened, Smiley would always win. So this is how he won a lot of money. But things came to a climax when Andrew Jackson was put up against a dog that had no hind legs, no rear legs, because they had been cut off. And when the money had been placed and all, and Andrew Jackson made a grab for the hind legs, he found that there were no hind legs. And since this was the only tactic that Andrew Jackson used, he had no other way. He had no other trick up his sleeve, as they say. So he lost the fight, and he was hurt very badly. He not only lost the fight, but he was hurt badly, because you know that in a dog fight, when you have 2 dogs fighting, one will be injured very badly, and when one of the dogs finds out that he is winning the battle or the fight, he will sometimes injure the other dog to death. So when Andrew Jackson finds out that this other dog does not have any hind legs, he is totally frustrated, and the other dog turns around on him and he bites him to the extent that Andrew Jackson just looks at Smiley as if to give him the impression that he has been betrayed, because this was the only trick that he had. And when there were no hind legs that he could grab hold of and hold on to, he was attacked by the other dog, he limped off, and then he just lay down and died, because he had only one trick. He was not a fighter. He was not the kind of dog who would go out and bite. All that he did was he'd hold on to the hind leg. And when there were no hind legs, he was the one who got beaten up. It was a good pup, the writer says, and would have made a name for himself if he had lived. But the thing is that he died a very young death. He didn't have any opportunities. He had only one trick, and that was something that he used again and again until the time came when he could not use it anymore. So he's given you 2 examples of this man betting. One, he had a mare. The other, he had a bulldog that he used again and again. And then he says that this year Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats. So he had a lot of these creatures that he was using for his bets, and he would bet on anything and everything. And then he says he catched a frog one day, and you see how he's written catched. It should actually have been he caught a frog one day, but because Twain is writing in the style of the common people, he uses the same diction. So he says he catched a frog one day and took him home and said that he was going to educate the frog. In other words, he was going to train the frog. And he said that if you train a frog, if you educate a frog, the frog will do anything. So he takes him to his backyard and he teaches him how to jump. Now, this is where Twain creates humor, because jumping is something that comes instinctively to frogs. You don't have to teach a frog to jump. But here, Mr. Jim Smiley makes a conscious attempt. He holds regular training sessions for the frog, and he trains him to jump. So what he would do is he'd give him a little punch on the behind, and you'd see this frog jumping and taking a long, long jump. And when he jumped, it wasn't just a simple jump. He turned a somersault in the air. Maybe he turned 2 somersaults, and you would find him a long way from where he had been. And being a frog, having no bones, he would jump on his, he would land on his feet unharmed. So this is what he was training his frog to do. So it's not just simple jumping that he's doing, he's turning somersaults also. And in this picture, you see him flipping backward. So he'd do a backward flip in the air, and then he would go a long distance. He got him up in the matter of catching flies so much, and he kept him in such constant practice that the frog would nail a fly every time. You know how now this is a little, yucky. You know how frogs catch flies? They stick their tongues out and they trap flies. So every time that he'd see a fly, he'd flick his tongue out, trap the fly, eat the fly, and that was it. So this is how he trained the frog. And it's interesting how this Jim Smiley gives names to these creatures. Remember, the bulldog was called what? Andrew Jackson. This one is called Daniel Webster. Now, Daniel Webster, did a lot of work for languages. He's a big name in the United States. So calling a frog Daniel Webster was telling people how educated his frog was, how learned he was. So all he had to do was say, Daniel flies, and Daniel's tongue would flick out, trap flies, eat them up, flick out again, and he would clear the space very shortly. So he could be relied on to jump, turn somersaults. He could also be relied on to clean a room of flies. And he became an expert at that. And throughout it all, Twain says that Daniel Webster was not the kind of frog who would boast. Now, one of the instincts of a frog is to jump. The other is to croak. The sound that a frog makes is called a croak. And croaking is also used for human beings who are always talking about themselves and who sing their own praises. So he says that Daniel never made a lot of sound, in the sense that he never went around calling attention to himself. He was a very modest and straightforward frog. But when it came to jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed. So he could out jump any other frog that you could produce. And this was one aspect on which Smiley bet a lot of money, because he knew that his frog could jump the farthest. And he was justly proud of this frog, because people would come from all over the place. They would see the frog and they'd say, "We have not seen a frog jumping so far," or "We have not seen a frog nailing flies so fast." So this is an image of Daniel Webster. Well, Smiley kept the beast. Now Twain calls him a beast. A beast is a wild animal. A frog is just a creature. It's not even in the category of animals, of large animals. You know that a frog is an amphibian. A frog can live in water as well as on land. But Smiley keeps him in a little lattice box. So he keeps him in a little box, and he would take him downtown when he wanted to lay bets. And then one day a person came up and asked him what was in the box. So when he's asked what's in the box, he has this way of answering, and he says, "It might be a parrot or it might be a canary, maybe, but it isn't. It's just a frog." So the other person takes the frog and says, so what's he good for? You know, what is so surprising about this frog? There are so many other frogs out there. And Smiley says, well, you know, he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County. So the man takes the box again, looks at Daniel Webster again, gives it back to Smiley and says, I don't see no points about that frog that says that it's any better than any other frog. So the other person, the stranger, does not believe Jim Smiley. Says, maybe you don't. Maybe you understand frogs and maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you've had experience and maybe you haven't. Anyway, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County. $40 was a lot of money back then. You're talking about the 1860s, the 1870s. So $40 was a lot of money. And he says, I can bet you $40 you can bring in any frog, and my frog, Daniel Webster, will outjump that frog. So the fellow says, well, I'm only a stranger here, but if I had a frog, I'd place a bet with you. And Smiley says, that's okay. You hold this box, and I'll get you a frog. And so what happens is that the man takes the box, puts his $40 with Smiley's $40, and sits down to wait. So he waits and he waits, and while he's waiting, he has an idea. He takes the frog out, he pulls his mouth open, and with a teaspoon he fills him full of quail shot. You know what quail shot is? Those tiny, tiny bullets that you fire with an air gun. How many of you have heard the word chara? You know what a chara is? That's quail shot. That is what you use to hunt birds. You don't use bullets. You use quail shot. You use bird shot. So bird shot or quail shot is chare. They're very, very tiny. So what he does is he fills a teaspoon of quail shot and he puts that in the frog's mouth. Okay. He fills him with quail shot and then puts him on the floor. Poor Daniel Webster. Smiley goes to the swamp. He brings a frog and gives it to this man, and he says, now, if you're ready, I'll put him along with Daniel Webster and we'll see who jumps the farthest. So he gives instruction and he says, place his forepaws even with Daniel Webster's forepaws. Put them in one line. And then he says, 1, 2, 3, git. And they touched the frogs from behind. The new frog made a jump, and that was it. But what about Daniel? Daniel tried to pull himself up. He couldn't even jump. And this is the frog that Smiley had said could outjump any frog. Poor fellow, he was full with bird shot, with quail shot. He couldn't move. And so, he says, he was planted as solid as a church. He couldn't stir, he couldn't move. It was like he was anchored there. Smiley was surprised and he was disgusted and he said, what is this? So the money had been put there. The stranger took the $40 because his frog had jumped. Daniel Webster had not. So he took the $80, 40 of his own, 40 of Jim Smiley's. And when he was going out, remember that one sentence that he had uttered earlier? What was it? He'd said, I don't see anything about this frog that impresses me. And so when he's going out, he again says, I don't see any points about that frog that show that he's a better frog than the others. So Smiley stood and he scratched his head and he looked down at Daniel, and at last he says, I don't know what it is that has happened. I wonder if there's something wrong with Daniel. He appears to look a little baggy, a little spread out. So then what he does is, and here you see Daniel Webster and the bulldog, and you see Jim Smiley picking the frog up, and when he picks up the frog, he says, he weighs 5 pounds. How did the frog get to be so heavy? So he picks up the frog by one leg and he turns him upside down, and what happens is everything that was in the frog comes out. All that quail shot comes out, and the frog is as light as it was before. So that was when Jim Smiley became so angry. He was so angry, he just wanted to catch hold of that man. And he tried, he ran after him, he tried to find him, but he never could. He never could find the stranger. So he couldn't find the stranger, And Twain takes a moment here to say that this is where Simon Wheeler's name was called out. And he said, you know, you sit here for a moment, I'm going to be back. And Twain says that I did not think that I was going to stay here to listen to another story, and I thought that I would, you know, go because I'd asked him for Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and he had started off on this long story about Jim Smiley. So he starts to leave, and when he's leaving the tavern, he meets Wheeler coming in, and Wheeler takes him back to the corner and says, you know, this Smiley had a yellow one-eyed cow that had no tail, only just a short stump. And here is where Twain becomes a little rude, and he says, you know, I really, really have to go now, because he doesn't want Simon Wheeler to launch off into another story about a cow. He's told us about the dog, he's told us about the horse, he's told us about the frog, and now he starts off with the cow. So before I take permission from you, I'd like to quickly go through this story of the jumping frog of Calaveras County. Twain starts off the story by saying that a friend of his had written to him from one of the eastern states and had asked him to trace a certain person by the name of Leonidas W. Smiley and to ask a man named Simon Wheeler. And Twain says that after what happened to me, I have come to the conclusion that my friend never knew anyone called Leonidas W. Smiley, that it was all a myth, a story. The person did not exist, because when I traced Simon Wheeler down and I asked him if he knew about Leonidas W. Smiley, he started off on this long story about a man named Jim Smiley, and this is how the story unfolded. And he starts off the story and he tells him about Jim Smiley being a gambler by choice, a person who would place bets on many different things. Anything that was happening, anything that he could see, he would say, if this happens, I'll give you this much money. If this happens, you give me that much money. So he was placing bets all the time. He went so far as to place bets on the priest's wife's health. And this bet he placed with no one else but the priest himself. So he would place a bet with anyone at any time and for any reason. He had a horse, and this horse appeared to be a very weak and a very sick horse. But somehow or the other, she would win the race for Jim Smiley, and Jim Smiley gathered a lot of money that way. Then he tells us about a bullpup that he had, and it was a very small bullpup, and he calls the bullpup what? What's the name that he gives him? Andrew Jackson. He names him after one of the American presidents, and he says that this bullpup was involved in a lot of dog fights, but he had this one strategy, this one way of holding on to the hind leg of the other dog, and he would win a lot of fights because the other dog could not turn around and attack him. And then this was how Jim Smiley made a lot of his money, placed a lot of bets, and he won all the bets. He won all the bets that he placed on the horse. He won all but one of the bets that he placed on the dog. And the one that he lost was because the dog that he was fighting had no hind legs because they had been sawed off. And so Andrew Jackson had nothing to hold on to. The other dog beat Andrew Jackson almost to death. And then Twain launches into what is really goes with the title of the story, and that is that one day he caught a frog from the swamp, and he took the frog to his home, and he said, I'm going to teach him how to jump. So he gives him training. He trains him every day and all the day until Daniel Webster, that's the name of the frog, until Daniel Webster can outjump any other frog. He becomes expert at long jumps, and these are not just simple plain jumps. Daniel Webster, the frog, can do somersaults in the air while he's jumping, and I showed you a picture where he's flipping backwards. So he can do that sort of thing, and that also continues until Nemesis overtakes Jim Smiley in the form of a stranger who comes and who wants to know what Jim Smiley is carrying. And when he's introduced to the frog, he says, I don't see anything special about him. So Jim Smiley says that I'll place a bet, and I'll bet $40 that my frog, Daniel Webster, can outjump any frog that you may bring from Calaveras County. So he says, well, I don't know, I'm a stranger here. And Jim Smiley says, okay, you hold on to my box, I'll go and get you a frog. So he gets him a frog, but meanwhile the stranger has this brilliant idea, and he fills the frog with quail shot, and then he just puts him on the floor. Now when you fill a frog with quail shot, he not only becomes very heavy, but he also cannot move. So when Daniel Webster is placed on the floor, he stays there. Meantime, Jim Smiley comes back with a frog for the stranger, and when they put them side by side and their behinds are touched, the new frog jumps. Daniel Webster cannot jump. So the stranger takes the money, takes the $40 that Jim Smiley has placed as a bet, and he just walks away and disappears. Meanwhile, Jim Smiley cannot understand what has happened. So he picks up the frog and says, oh God, this frog is so heavy. So he turns him upside down, and all the quail shot, the frog sort of vomits it out, because when it's turned upside down, everything comes out. And Jim Smiley gets so angry that he rushes after the stranger to catch him, because he feels that he has been cheated. Here he has trained a frog to jump, and not just to jump, but to do somersaults also. And here you have a stranger who just comes in and walks away with his $40. So he went after him and he tried to catch him, but he was unsuccessful. Now at this point, Simon Wheeler, who is narrating the story, gets called to the front yard of the tavern, and when he leaves, the writer also gets up to leave because he's tired. He has asked about Leonidas W. Smiley, and he has had to hear a story about a totally different person, and so he rushes out and he says, you know, I'm leaving. But as he's leaving the tavern, Simon Wheeler is coming in, and Wheeler says, oh, I haven't told you about this cow that Jim Smiley had. And it appeared a little rude, but this is where the writer says that I had to request for leave. I had to request Simon Wheeler to let me go, because I had a lot of things that I wanted to deal with. So thank you for having been so patient with me. I'll be back with another story by Mark Twain in the next lecture. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.